Okay, we're good? Yeah. Yes, I'd like to call the City of Newark Planning Commission of Tuesday, March 12th, 2024 to order. Would you please rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Welcome, welcome. Item number A is roll call. Let the record reflect that all commissioners are present, all 5 of us. Item number 2, well, we're going to do a little switch around on this. We're going to have the election of officers first. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so we're going to move to the election of officers. Every year we do have a new chairman and a vice chair, and we kind of rotate that. And I would like to start off with nominating Jeff Aguilar to be the chair of this current year coming up in 2024. And we need a second.
I'll second that.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded to make Jeff Aguilar the chair. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries 5 ayes. And then we need a motion for the vice chair.
I would like to make a nomination for Commissioner Bogusich.
Okay, very good. I'll second that. And so we have her up for vice chair. All in favor of signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? No. So unanimous approval. So we have 2 new officers, a chair and a vice chair. I'd just like to say now that I'm not the chair anymore, I'll be passing the gavel over to Commissioner Aguilar, but just wanted to say that I really was honored to serve as the chair for this past year. I think we have a good commission that does their homework, comes up on time, and asks good, educated questions, and I think we have a good relationship with the staff and the community, so I'm very proud to turn it over to Jeff. He's done it before, and so at this time, I'll just switch chairs with Jeff. We'll move over that way. I'll leave you the gavel.
Go. I'll hand you your notebook here.
Good, now I can take a nap. Great. Okay. Trade phones? No. Okay.
Oh, here's your water.
Okay, good.
Okay. To keep things moving along, item B2, approval of minutes of the regular Planning Commission meeting of January 23rd, 2024. We'll need a motion.
I make a motion.
Second?
Second.
Okay. I have a motion from Commissioner Bogusich, a second from Commissioner Fitz. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay. Let the record reflect. Motion carries. 5 ayes. Item C, written communications.
No written communications tonight.
Item D, oral communications. Any members of the public are invited to address the Planning Commission on any item not listed on the agenda. And also confirming, we're no longer accepting Zoom.
That is correct.
Okay. Thank you. Moving on to item E, public hearings. There are none on the agenda tonight. Item F, staff reports. F1, housing legislation overview. A review of important state legislation affecting local jurisdictions regarding residential development requirements and housing production.
Thank you very much, Chair Aguilar. I'm Stephen Turner, Community Development Director. I'm happy to bring forward an opportunity for the Commission to hear about various state legislation that affects housing production, both here in Newark, but really across around the state. As we heard at the Planning Commissioners Academy, the state legislature has been very busy over the past few years with regard to coming up with new legislation that will incentivize or encourage or in some cases force local jurisdictions to produce more housing and to address the affordable housing in the state. And so they're doing that in a number of different ways and have been doing so over the years. We thought that it would be a good opportunity tonight with a light agenda to have an overview of some of the more significant state laws that affect Newark And to help us with that information, we invited Alex Mogg from Myers-Nave. He and his firm represent the city on attorney matters, and so he's very well versed and qualified to be able to provide this information to us. I will mention that although a lot of the discussion tonight will be, in fact, all of the discussion will be focused on existing legislation. Again, as we learned at the Planning Commissioners Academy, the legislators are very busy in crafting all sorts of new legislation that is under consideration that could affect Newark as well. And they're very busy as they've have been in the past couple of years. And I think we heard that there's, well over 200 bills that are circulating that have some sort of housing or land use component to them. So we will have to keep track of all of those, the status of those, particularly those to Newark. And certainly we will work with our attorney's office to be mindful of that new legislation. But with that, we'll focus on the legislation that's affecting Newark now. And Alex has a presentation that will last between 30 and 40 minutes with questions. I think because of the material, there's a lot of it. And certainly commissioners may have questions along the way. I think we thought it best to feel free to ask questions as we go along, rather than waiting to the very.
Okay.
So we'll, with the concurrence of the chair, that's how we'll do that.
Perfect. So if we have a question, would you like us to raise hand?
Yeah, maybe
Stop
raise
you?
hands.
Okay, we'll do
that
it.
works. So with that, I'll introduce Alex Mogg from the City Attorney's Office.
Thank you, Stephen. Good evening, Commission. Like Stephen mentioned, the legislature has been very busy. They sort of just throw everything against the wall, see what sticks. They have this annoying habit of passing like 3 or 4 bills that are all on the same topic, and you have to go through them and try to figure out what's different about them. But I guess it keeps us all on our toes. So, like Stephen mentioned, there's a lot of bills we're going to run through pretty quickly. A lot of these bills are pages and pages long. We're only really talking about high-level overview to make sure the commission's familiar with the general concept, and feel free to interrupt with questions whenever they arise. So the Housing Accountability Act is been on the books a very long time, but it's been used more and more in recent years, and is, I think, the most important housing law in California, because all of the other laws we'll talk about really add on to it and play with it in some ways. So what this law says is that a jurisdiction cannot deny a housing project or approve it at a lower density if that project complies with all of the applicable objective standards in place at the time the application is deemed complete. So if a project meets all of the city's objective zoning, general plan standards, the city essentially has to approve the project. And importantly, the city only has, when it gets a complete application, first it has 30 days to determine whether it's complete or not. But once it's determined to be complete, the city only has 30 to 60 days to determine whether or not that project is inconsistent. And we have to notify the applicant within that time period and identify in writing any of the inconsistencies. And if we don't identify, for example, you're not meeting a setback requirement or a height requirement or whatever in that period of time, they're deemed to comply with the requirement. So it puts staff certainly on a crunch to get applications reviewed quickly.
So just an example of that, just to say if a developer comes in with a project with 100 units and 100 units meets the underlying density of the project, the commission or the council, whoever's the deciding body, cannot say, well, we'll only approve this project at 50 units, so to reduce the density there. So that's not a reason or a way that they kind of control or create smaller projects when the projects that are being considered are consistent with all of the objective standards.
And the city still has the ability to issue, conditions of approval, but, you can imagine there is a point at which your condition of approval amounts to denying the project. So onerous, or is requiring, if you require the condition of approval is you change your whole layout of the building, that's really just a denial of the project. So the law requires approval if you comply with all of the objective standards. What's an objective standard? An objective standard is a standard that involves no personal or subjective judgment and is uniformly verifiable. So we can all go out with our measuring tape and measure how tall a building is, and we can say, yes, this building is, higher or lower than our 20-foot height limit. In contrast, a subjective standard involves personal judgment. So if we say a building has to be of similar height to its surrounding buildings, one person might say, hey, a two-story building in a residential area with only one-story buildings, that's not similar. Where someone else might think, yeah, 2 stories, that's pretty similar to 1 story. It's not like it's a 40-story building. There's no objective measure there. So many codes have historically had very subjective standards in them. And because of these new housing laws, cities are really going through and updating that to try to get objective standards in there to ensure we have something that's enforceable. So Stephen mentioned we can't deny a project, break it up into little pieces, but we can only deny a project if it meets the objective standards in very limited, narrow circumstances. The project would have to have, one is if it violates state or federal law. The second is if it would have a specific adverse impact on public health or safety. And you might think, well, that still gives the city some flexibility, but that actually is a very narrow definition. So that's defined to mean a significant, quantifiable, direct, and unavoidable impact based on objective, identified, written public health or safety standards, policies, or conditions as they existed on the date the application was complete. So you really have to be able to point to a written, adopted standard that they would be violating, which is hard to do, frankly. And there has to be no feasible method to mitigate or avoid the impact. So if you can mitigate it, then that's not an option. So it's a very difficult standard to meet, and you are subject, if you violate it, you are subject to fines of up to $10,000 per unit. There was just a settlement a few weeks ago involving the city of Berkeley where they ended up having to pay over $1 million in fines because they had delayed and denied the project under list law. And so you're still subject to a discretionary review project. These projects would still come before the Planning Commission, depending on if the city's zoning, but your authority and your discretion is really curtailed there. You're really looking at a narrow set of issues because you can't deny the project. But because it's discretionary, it is still subject to CEQA review, which is helpful because that CEQA review is where you might find some of those adverse impacts we talked about previously.
So
Yeah.
would the adverse impact could be traffic if there's not enough room for parking, they don't have adequate parking, and that's going to cause traffic, and that might have to have less amounts of units because you need more parking? or
Well,
something?
so parking's a good example. I would say in general, parking is not something that has a specific adverse impact on public health or safety, right? If you can't park, maybe you park farther away and you have to walk, that's inconvenience, but generally is not a public impact on public health and safety. And to the extent, sometimes you think, oh, narrow streets, they might cause fire. Emergency vehicles have trouble getting through them. Well, you can paint them red for no parking and mitigate that impact. So it's a very narrow set of circumstances that would lead you to be able to find this setting. So I've seen this, for example, invoked successfully sometimes in like a hillside where they're trying to grade and they're not complying with a grading ordinance, and you can maybe point to standards about slope, and this is going to cause a landslide, like that sort of. We have an objective standard on the book someplace, and that sort of public health and safety. which is different than what we evaluate in CEQA, right? In CEQA, we do talk about things that aren't necessarily adverse. We look at impacts on the environment, but those are not necessarily the same as impacts on public health or safety, right? You can imagine a impact on a view, that's something that would be considered in CEQA, but that's not an adverse impact on public health or safety. So SB 330 is basically the largest law that's been adopted in recent years by the state. It was adopted in 2019 as the Housing Crisis Act and has a bunch of different parts. One of the main things it does is create a preliminary application process. So we mentioned the Housing Accountability Act says you can't disapprove a project if it complies with the standards in place at the time a complete application is submitted. SB 330 says, well, if you submit a preliminary application, it locks that in even earlier. So you can't deny a project that complies with objective standards at the time a preliminary application is submitted. Essentially, the legislature was trying to prevent bad acting cities from changing their rules when they heard projects were in the works and changing their rules in the last minute. A preliminary application requires less than a full application, but it still requires a decent, it's not like a back of an envelope, notation. You have a site plan, a lot of information spelled out there. So it locks in the standards earlier in the process. Fees can be adjusted during it. It doesn't lock in fees, but it only allows you to increase them based on the CPI adjustment that you have adopted. So if you were to adopt a brand new fee, it wouldn't apply to a project that submitted a preliminary application. Once you submit the preliminary application, a developer has to submit the complete application within 180 days, or they lose that sort of vesting, locking into those earlier standards. And then once a project is approved, they have to start construction within 2.5 years, which seems like a long period of time, but you would be surprised, especially in this high interest rate market. You are seeing projects not meet that and get it done in time. And I will just note that you are allowed to change your project between the time you submit a preliminary application and when you submit a complete application by up to 20% of the units. So you could increase or decrease it by up to 20% of the units or square footage. It would still have to, comply with the objective standards, but you could make those tweaks. Some additional things SB 330 does. The other really major one is it prevents a city from essentially downzoning, from changing the zoning that applies to a residential property to one on which allows a less intensive use. And that's anything that would lessen the intensity of housing. So, you think the most obvious example is you change the density from, 30 units an acre to 20 units an acre. But other things could potentially decrease the intensity of housing too, right? If you allow 30 units an acre, let's say we don't touch the density, but we decrease the height from 50 feet to 20 feet, that's going to have the impact of preventing how many units you can actually build on that site. So those sorts of things are prohibited. The only exception to this rule is if you do it, you have to essentially upzone another parcel so it's net neutral and there's no loss to the amount of housing capacity in the city. And this can be problematic, though. In fact, in my experience, how you see this most often come up is that a developer or applicant wants to come in and rezone a parcel to allow maybe a commercial use on a site that doesn't allow it, and it becomes tricky of how do we accommodate that project without, getting rid of the residential zoning. And so you see a lot of cities adopting sort of more and more mixed use zones so they can allow that commercial without prohibiting the residential. And yes.
So is it up to the city's discretion of the zoning, or is the city tied by the state?
So this law does not require the city to change its zoning. it prevents the city from changing in a way that would decrease the
Right.
housing, but it does not,
Say that you have to change an
it doesn't say
industrial
you
to
have to
housing.
change, no.
Okay.
There's also rules, limits on demolition of existing residential units, especially if they're not going to be replaced with more units. The idea being we want to keep the housing stock in place. And then another thing is it prohibits for projects that meet all the objective standards, it prevents more than 5 hearings for a project. And that includes public hearings, workshops, study sessions, planning commission, city council, all total just 5. And that hasn't been a huge issue here, but there are some communities where they're really, you'll be surprised, but they're talking about the same project 4 or 5 meetings and really just draw out the process. So the next law to touch base on is SB 35. You may have heard about this in the news. A lot of cities, especially sort of San Francisco, Berkeley, Oakland, have seen a lot of these projects recently. But what SB 35 does is create a streamlined ministerial process for approval of qualifying projects. And ministerial means it is essentially a staff level decision. You go down the list, you check the box, do you meet all the requirements? If you do, you're approved by staff, no public hearing. And importantly, because it's ministerial, that also means no CEQA for these projects. And streamlined, meaning that there are tight time frames for these projects to be reviewed and approved. So this is applied, this law applies in cities that have issued fewer building permits than their share of the regional housing needs assessment by income category. I'm sure the commission is familiar with RENA from the recent adoption of the housing element, but it applies basically everywhere, especially now that we've reset into a new housing element cycle. I would be sort of surprised if cities aren't subject to this, in a couple of years across the board, just because the RENA allocations increase so much. It's frankly, maybe not true, but I think no city's going to meet their RENA allocation, whereas in the past, there were some smaller cities who were able to meet their RENA allocation. So this applies to projects of any size, but if you're over 10 units, you have to meet certain affordability requirements. 10% of the units have to be affordable to low-income households, which are 80% of the area median income. Or in the Bay Area, there's a special exception allowing you can do 20% of the units as moderate. So you can decide which project works for you. If you have met the above moderate income goal, so if a city has met their market rate housing, but has not met the other income categories, which is more common. You see some cities that have done that in the last cycle. Then 50% of the units need to be low income. The thinking being, if a city is doing a quote unquote good job of producing market rate housing, then in order to take advantage of this law, we'll only let you do it for an affordable project.
And Chair Aguilar, so in the last cycle, Newark fell into that 50%. Are more market rate units than what our RENA allocation was for that particular cycle. So developers would have to come in and meet that 50% threshold of affordability levels in order to qualify for that ministerial type of action. Now, Newark has not seen any SB 35 projects, and it's a request of the developer for that, and I think we're not exactly sure why that is. I mean, we've definitely had some 100% affordable housing projects come forward, but not any 50% housing projects come forward. So just either the project types never really met the thresholds for SB 35. We either had 100% affordable or some smaller percentage. And of course, Newark, you could just pay the fee to satisfy the affordable housing requirements as well.
If a developer opts to use SB 35, are they subject to different labor laws than a
They
standard?
are. So, and we'll get to that in a minute. So I'll run through the first bullet points then and touch on that. But so there are a lot of requirements in SB 35 about the project site. You have to meet the zoning and general plan designation. You know, if it's mixed use, it has to be 2/3 residential. There are a lot of other site-specific standards. You know, you can't be in the flood zone, you can't be in an earthquake zone, you can't be on an industrial site. There are a bunch of standards like that. You used to not be allowed in the coastal zone. They've tweaked that recently. And the project has to comply with the city's objectives standards that would apply to the project. But to your point, Chair, for larger projects over that 10-unit threshold, you have to pay prevailing wage and use a skilled and trained workforce, which is essentially union workers. And so that really increases the cost of construction. So in some areas where you've seen these projects, San Francisco, Berkeley, Oakland, some of the very extremely expensive peninsula cities right there, they can command the rents to make that pencil out in the end. Or in, you know, like a case of San Francisco, they may already just be paying that based on the local market. And so it makes sense for them, especially in a city that requires you build 10 or 15% of the units as affordable. You may already qualify for this automatically. And so, hey, why not? If we qualify, let's do it. And, you know, so, but I definitely think the labor standards are a reason that is.
When does SB 30, you brought up a good point earlier. So right now, I would presume if an applicant wanted to use SB 35, they're operating off the previous, I guess, fifth cycle housing element. Yeah. When does the next tranche hit for them?
I forget, HCD will make a reassessment for everyone. There's a weird element in the law because they were mad at San Francisco, and so San Francisco gets reassessed every year. And but everyone else, they'll make a reassessment. I think it's halfway through the cycle, if I recall correctly, that they make their assessments. So streamlined process, I'll just squeeze through this quickly. You know, it means you have to act quickly. 60 days for most projects, 90 days if they're very big. And like other projects, if we don't respond and identify something, it's deemed complete. And because it's a ministerial process, CEQA doesn't apply because CEQA only applies to discretionary decisions of the city. So SB 4 is a new law that just went into effect, and it's referred to sometimes as YIGBY, yes in God's backyard bill. So this is very similar in many ways to SB 35 and is modeled after SB 35, but it creates streamlined ministerial projects. Streamlined ministerial process, for affordable housing projects on land either owned by a higher education institute or religious institution. So if there's a church who wants to build a housing in their parking lot or something like that, they could qualify under this law. They don't need to comply. Unlike SB 35, the big difference is they don't need to comply with the zoning or general plan. The law sets out sort of maximum density requirements that they can do. In residential districts, it's about 30 units an acre, and a height of 1 story above the otherwise allowable limit. But unlike SB 35, the project is required to be 100% affordable. So you can do 20%, 100% affordable for low-income households, which is the 80% of area median income level, or up to 20% of that can be for moderate income households. So you can imagine, student housing, for example, would qualify, or if a religious institution just wants to do affordable housing on their site, that would qualify. And then it has to meet SB 35's extensive site-specific and labor standards, and it actually has a couple other site-specific requirements in here because it's anticipating projects on sites that aren't zoned to be residential, right? For SB 35, you had to be on a site that allowed residential, and this is not the case. So there are some other rules in here about industrial. You can't be next to an industrial site or some other things like that.
Is that what was used when Berkeley decided to build the housing on People's Park?
No, so that is different. So this would be Berkeley. UC Berkeley is a state, so state doesn't have to follow any local rules. They can just build whatever they want. But if like a private college wanted to build, they would do that. And actually, you know, Cal States and community colleges may have separate rules too. The UC has special power, so they can just basically do whatever they want.
Okay.
So density bonus law, this is another really important major law that's existed for quite some time, but is getting used more and more and more. And it's getting used in ways, I think, not quite how originally intended by the law. So a developer who builds a certain percentage of affordable housing units is entitled to a specific density bonus. So for example, let's say the city has a density limit of 20 units an acre, and the developer is providing enough affordable housing to qualify for a 10% bonus. They can now do 22 units an acre. So you can imagine on bigger projects and for bigger bonuses, this can really allow you to go much higher than the city's density bonus. And the greater the percentage of affordable units, the larger the density bonus, but also the deeper the affordability, the larger the bonus. And Newark doesn't have an inclusionary ordinance, but in those cities that say you have to do 10% affordable, those count towards the requirement. So in a lot of cities, you automatically are going to get these bonuses because you're already mandated to do affordable. So this chart, frankly, is already out of date because the density bonus law is one of those laws the legislature tinkers with every year, and they'll probably adopt 2 or 3 bills every year to tinker with it. Not necessarily in huge ways, but in recent years, they've sort of expanded your ability to use density bonus when you have moderate income units, or especially if they're for sale or things like this. So this is just sort of to show you a general sense of, you know, if you have, 10% affordable units, if those are moderate units, you only get a 5% bonus. If those 10% units are low income, you would get a 20% bonus. And if they are very low income units, you would get a third bonus. And probably 2 or 3 years ago, the legislature added, if you are 100% affordable, you can get an 80% bonus. So you see some of these affordable housing projects come in, and they can really go much bigger than the density otherwise allowed. And we talked about, the density bonus part of the density bonus, but there's actually 2 other important elements we're going to talk about. The first is what's known as either incentives or concessions. Those terms both are used, but it is depending on how affordable the project is, an applicant will be entitled to either 1, 2, 3, or 4 incentives. And you can use that incentive to reduce any standard that the city has. So if you don't comply with something, let's say an open space requirement or something, you can say, I'm using one of my incentives for that. So it could be a zoning standard. It could be a public art requirement. It could be all of it. You have to show. We'll talk about it in a minute, but it's very difficult to deny these. So on top of that, even without using an incentive or concession, the state density bonus law has a requirement that a city not impose more than 1 parking space requirement for a 1-bedroom unit or 1.5 spaces for a 2 to 3 bedroom. So regardless of the city's normal standards, that's the maximum you can impose, and then someone could use their incentive to lower that even further. So this law, well, I'll hold off and I'll make this commentary in a minute. But the next thing,
Alex, I might make a commentary.
Yeah.
Maybe in her place. I mean, and it may be just also a question to you. From my experience, and I think what we heard actually at the planning commissioners, the real value in density bonus law is not additional density, but the waivers, concessions that come with them. So that developers really, they want the reduced parking, they want the reduced setbacks, they want greater height. One of the interesting things that we heard at the academy was that some developers are also seeking lower densities than what cities have, because if cities set a minimum density that is too high, it can make those projects infeasible. And so they ask for a lower density in order to make the project feasible, and that appears to be an allowed concession or waiver for these types of projects, which is very interesting. I had not heard that approach being used before, but it really sort of was very interesting.
Exactly right. And so the waiver process, we talked about concessions. A waiver is you can waive any standard that would physically preclude you from building the project at the allowable density. And so you can imagine if you have 100 units an acre, you're allowed to do a 100-unit project on 1 acre. You can't do that if the height limit is 10 feet. You need to be able to go higher than that. There used to be sort of some constraints on this. We would say, hey, sure, you can go higher, but why do your floors have 15-foot ceilings? You should lower them down to 10 feet or 9 feet, and we can, that's all you can do. Recently, courts have said, no, you have to take the project as opposed, and basically it's almost impossible now to deny a waiver. But to Stephen's point, when this law was originally adopted, I think the legislature envisioned, right, you're coming in with an affordable housing project. We want to make sure you can build that project. You can get the amount of more units usually means it's easier to pencil. And we want you to be able to build it. To make sure you can build it, you need to possibly get out of some of these city standards. And so that's how the original intent was. But now you see projects that don't want the density bonus at all. They just want to get out of some of these standards. And this has really changed in the last 3 or 4 years.
So it's just like giving them free passes.
It is, absolutely. So you can only deny a waiver or concession if it would violate state or federal law, or if it would have that specific adverse impact on public health and safety that we talked about earlier, which is a very narrow standard. So, it can apply occasionally, but very rarely. So it becomes very difficult and important, I'll say, for this and the Housing Accountability Act. The burden is on the city to establish that and to prove that by preponderance of an evidence. So, the city's determination is not going to get any deference if that decision is challenged. And the last really important point is that a project receiving a bonus, concession, or a waiver is considered to be consistent with the objective standards. So that the Housing Accountability Act now comes in and prevents you from denying that project. Because it complies. If you use, a waiver to get out of the height standard, you're deemed to have complied with the height standard.
How many waivers can
An unlimited number.
Unlimited?
So, yeah.
Based upon the number of affordable or percentage of affordable units?
No, so it's unlimited number. Now you can get into dispute with the developer. So concessions have a limit. Waivers are unlimited, but waivers have to be something that would physically preclude the project from being built. So you can sometimes get into, you don't want to do X, but you could actually accommodate it in this way. And so you still have to do it. So a height thing might be hard to get out of, but we've seen developers who maybe say, well, I don't have to comply with the open space requirement because I can't put, there's no room for the open space over here. I couldn't have the same footprint. And we've told them, well, you can do balconies or you can do rooftop open space stuff. So there are sometimes ways to address it, but it's very difficult. And there is a recent case that every developer cites to now that basically says, well, cities, you have to take the project as it was submitted, and you can't redesign their project to comply with your standards. So it's become very, 5 years ago, we would have told someone, we would have worked with them a little bit and said, well, sure, your setback, you can't meet our setback requirement, but if you tweak this layout a little bit, you can get 80% of the way there. And now developers are just refusing to do that, and they are pointing to this case and saying, you can't make me. And, based on how the legislature has been in recent years and the courts, I think cities don't really want to test that because they figure it's a losing case and you get the big fine behind you potentially.
So if they give you an application and the application includes parking and green space, and then you accept the application, and then they say, oh, wait, I want waivers. I
No,
don't
so
wanna do-"
they identify generally in their application, they will say we are seeking waivers on these things. So they would propose a project that didn't have the parking, and sometimes they tell you upfront, we're using a concession on this. Sometimes you identify in your written, you review it and you say you don't comply with X, Y, and Z, and they'll come back and they'll say we're entitled to 3 concessions and we're using them for A, B, and C, and then a waiver for Y or so. This law really constrains projects that want to do that include affordable units. Or rather, constrains the city's discretion regarding those projects. So AB 684 is a brand new law intended to target sort of missing middle sites. So it doesn't require any affordability, but it's intended to produce sort of smaller homeownership opportunities. So local agencies must ministerially approve parcel maps, or if it's tentative and final map, for a housing development project with 10 or fewer parcels or 10 or fewer units. Maximum size of 5 acres, which is still pretty big, right? A half-acre lot is pretty significant size. But your individual lots could be as small as 600 feet under this law. It only applies in multifamily zoning districts. It was originally proposed to apply anywhere, and then the legislature amended it at the last minute, so will only apply in multifamily zoning districts. But it's still pretty significant law. You don't need to comply with the city's minimum lot size or lot dimension requirements. I don't know off the top of my head, but I'm sure 600 square feet is much smaller than the city's allowable lot size. And the city can apply objective standards, but it can't apply objective standards that would preclude development at densities deemed naturally suitable to lower income households, which is 30 units an acre. So that's in a multifamily, the city's zoning standards in the multifamily area might already, have this in mind, so it might not be the biggest obstacle, but it certainly is a constraint on the city's zoning criteria. And this is not on any multifamily site, there are a number of site-specific criteria to ensure it's not an environmentally sensitive site, similar to those, can't be on a earthquake zone, and there's a number of those, but it's brand new, so we don't know how it's quite going to be used yet. You see the legislature will pass these laws pretty significant, and sometimes, I think almost uniformly, no one uses them right away because people don't understand them. Developers already have projects. They're not going to change their projects midstream. But for some laws, ADUs we've really seen exploded after the legislature has adopted those laws and focused on sort of tweaking it to make it easier. And then other laws they adopt, it seems like it's going to be a big deal and no one uses it, or it's really limited where it's used because of, often the labor standards or things like that. So AB 211 and SB 6 are two very similar laws that were adopted, I think, probably 3 years ago, and so far haven't been used very much. I think as much as they were heralded to do when they were passed, it was sort of declared like the end of zoning. But so far we haven't seen much of that. So this allows housing on sites where office, retail, or parking are principally permitted uses. So basically, commercial areas not zoned for housing, this law would allow them. Can't be adjacent to industrial site. Principally permitted means the use is allowed on more than a third of the square footage. So this would allow it on, it might be a site where retail is allowed, half of the site is retail. AB 211 creates a streamlined ministerial approval process. So there are two laws that both of them do that thing, but you have to meet different requirements. So AB 211 creates a streamlined ministerial process. So that means CEQA doesn't apply, they're strict, there's not gonna be a public hearing, you check all the boxes and you're approved. That's project only applies if either you're 100% affordable or you're along a commercial corridor, which is defined as a wide a street with a right of way between 75 and 150 feet, which are many of the roads here in town. You can imagine some smaller community commercial areas might not, and they're just against a 2-lane road, for example, even with parking, might not fall within that. And projects have to have a minimum density. So the idea is the legislature didn't want you putting single-family homes there, or they wanted a certain high level of density if you were going to go ahead and do this. But you may be entitled to go even greater than that. So SB 6 doesn't create a ministerial process, but the Housing Accountability Act, which we talked about earlier, would still apply. That does mean the project is subject to CEQA review. Both projects have a bunch of other development standards in them, because this is, these are going to be on commercial sites where the city hasn't zoned, the zoning doesn't anticipate residential. So some of the requirements are set forth in the laws. There may be a specific requirement of setbacks in the laws. For other standards, the law will tell you what zoning district to refer to. So for example, the maximum density under SB 6 is the density in the local zoning district that allows the minimum density. So we would look at what district allows the 30 units an acre, whatever the maximum district zoning is in that zoning district is what would apply to these projects. And there's often, take the, other zoning standards from the closest zone that allows multifamily use. So there are labor standards attached to these bills, which is probably why in some cases they aren't being used. For SB 6, you have to use, all projects have to pay prevailing wage, and then SB 6 projects have to use a skilled and trained workforce, and AB 211 projects must provide certain healthcare benefits to the workers. AB 1490 is another new project this year. I don't know if this was intended with what in mind exactly, but it's basically designed to allow reuse of existing buildings quickly and easily. So it creates as an allowable use the retrofitting and repurposing as a residential building an existing building, if that existing building is either existing residential building, or so maybe you're gonna change its density or configure it and add more units, or a commercial building that allows temporary occupancy, which is essentially a hotel or a motel. You want to convert a hotel to a permanent living space. The project has to be 100% low income, but it could be as low as, and it has to have 50% very low income. Jurisdictions can still impose objective standards except for the density. So this is really designed for 100% affordable housing projects. I think really designed for the idea of someone, a nonprofit, taking a hotel probably and converting it to permanent, and sort of not allowing a city to stop that.
Alex, this isn't the law that some developers might use to repurpose, say, a vacant office building? If, an office building was built on spec perhaps and never.
Correct.
Yeah, okay.
They would not be able to use this to repurpose an office building because that isn't it has to be a building that allowed a temporary occupancy.
Right, okay.
And temporary occupancy in the living sense, not the building code sense. So really hotel, motel, something like that. Although I am sure it is only a matter of time before there's a law that would allow that. And there are some laws proposed to do that right now, allow commercial conversions like that. They seem to be focused on San Francisco right now, but it may expand later. So SB 9, you may have heard of this. This is also a high-profile bill, probably 3 years ago, the so-called end of single-family zoning is what they called it. It requires cities to ministerially approve, so again, no hearing, checking the boxes. Or both actually, a two-lot subdivision, taking a single lot and dividing it into two, or putting 2 units on a lot. And you can do both of those things. So you could conceivably take 1 lot and end up with 4 units on it, 4 plus units actually. The lots have to be within a single-family residential zone, so those are really only are pure single-family neighborhoods. And they have to meet other criteria, so some projects won't qualify, but many sites will. Again, they can't be on any of these sensitive areas such as flood zones or high fire areas, although I would note that the way those sensitive areas are defined in state law often has a carve out. So like the high fire severity zone, it says, you can't have a project in this high fire severity zone unless you comply with building code requirements for hardening and fire prevention. So you can, in a lot of instances, you still would be able in some of these zones to do it. There's also some restrictions on using this project on property with existing residential. Essentially, the legislature was trying to prevent, didn't want landlords to evict existing tenants in order for a landlord to sort of develop that site. So for a 2-lot subdivision, each lot has to be at least 1,200 square feet. And you have to divide them roughly equally. So the smaller lot has to be at least 40% of the size of the original lot. So you're not going to get 1 big lot and 1 tiny lot. You're going to get 2 roughly equal size lots. And once you subdivide, you can't subdivide it again. And adjacent lots can't be subdivided if the owners are working together. So you can't have one person owning both 2 adjacent parcels and subdivide them both. But if they're completely independent actors, you could subdivide both of those. I think probably this hasn't been used a lot, I think, just because depending on it, if you have an existing single-family home, one, we'll talk about later, like it's just easier to build an ADU than it is to build a unit using this. And subdividing it can be really tricky because you got to make sure there's access to the right-of-way and other things, and it just hasn't been used a lot so far, at least. So we can still require easements for public services, access to the right-of-way, but we can't require, unlike a normal subdivision where we can require right-of-way dedication, off-site improvements, we can't require any of that type of thing for this small type of subdivision. We can impose our normal objective zoning standards, but we cannot apply them if they would physically prevent 800 square foot units. So, you know, an example is you might think of a lot coverage requirement. Well, if the lot is only 1,200 square feet, you know, you might not be able to enforce that if it would prevent an 800 square foot unit. And there are some requirements for setbacks very similar to the ADU setback requirement. However, there are no requirements for fees. There are no special rules for fees here, unlike ADUs. ADUs, small ADUs under 750 square feet don't have to pay impact fees or connection fees. If they're above that size, they get reduced fees. None of that applies to these SB9 units. So if you're building an SB9 unit, you know, you could probably build an ADU of the exact same size. If you can't, you know, why go through that process for an SB9 unit and have to pay all of those fees? You are not allowed to, we have to prohibit, the city has to prohibit short-term rentals of units created through SB9. We also have to require, if there's going to be a lot split, the applicant to sign an affidavit saying they intend to occupy one of the units as their principal residence for 3 years. That is completely impossible to enforce in any way because you could have intended to occupy it at the time you signed your affidavit and your circumstances changed and you no longer want to live there because something changed. So it's really, you know, it was completely useless. Yeah, it was just sort of to make it seem like there was something in there. And no other owner occupancy requirements are allowed. You can pair this with ADUs. So you could end up with even more units. You basically, you can't have a situation where you subdivide, build 2 units on both sites and have ADUs on all those lots, but you could have a situation where someone on one lot without subdividing maybe does 2 SB9 units in an ADU. So you can get a lot of units racking up there quickly on single-family lots that, you know, were not anticipated to accommodate that. So quick ADU updates. I'm sure over the years the commission has heard lots about ADUs, and they're becoming more and more used. I really think that it's the fee waiver, that fee reduction that has made them so widely used. Unlike those labor standards which increase the cost of using those laws, this decreases the cost of this. And the legislature has really been focused on, on making sure the ADU law works as they want it to. So every year there are 3 or 4 laws they do that change it, that have really sort of limited control and help people get their ADUs built, for better or for worse. You can really see numbers statewide of how many have been produced in the last few years. But a big change is that local agencies may now allow, not required, but can allow rentals of ADUs for less than 30 days and the separate sale of ADUs. You didn't used to be able to sell an ADU separately. So that's not required. These don't have to allow that, but a city can require that. And essentially you'd end up with some sort of, you know, equivalent to a condo map or something where you're selling the unit separately and it's still one parcel. And then within the next year, cities are required to adopt some pre-approved ADU designs and have those, if an applicant uses one of those designs, their review becomes even more streamlined. And instead of 60 days for review, it's 30 days for review, and it's very quickly. So many cities had, you know, I don't know, I can't remember if Newark did off the top of my head in its housing element, a program to adopt design.
It's not working well, but yes, we did.
So it's something that cities, even before this law was enacted, were sort of anticipating, hey, we'll have plans off the shelf that people can use to try to streamline that process and to show the state where, trying to meet our arena needs. But this sort of makes it uniform statewide and also decreases the review time for that. The other change in the ADU laws is there used to be a requirement that cities couldn't mandate a height limit less than 16 feet. That has been amended a little bit. So there's still a default sort of 16-foot requirement, but if your ADU is within a half mile of major transit, it's 18 feet. Or if it's a detached ADU on a multifamily parcel, it can be 18 feet. And then if you are an attached ADU, it's 25. It's either 25 feet or the height limit for the zoning district. So if you are going to be, adding a second story ADU to your house, for example, you could make that up to 25 feet tall or whatever the height limit is for the underlying zoning district. So that was really intended to accommodate second story ADUs. So that was a lot of information. When things are projected that big on such a big screen, they get a little blurry. But happy to answer any additional questions.
Yes, I have a couple of questions and maybe a comment. The term ministerial approval, does that eliminate the need for public hearings? And streamline ministerial approval, that's even more quick.
So streamlined means there's really short time frames attached to it, usually 30 or 60 days. Ministerial doesn't necessarily mean no public hearing. For some of these laws, it does explicitly say that, ministerial, no public hearing. But it doesn't necessarily mean that. But there's no discretion. You're really just checking the box of, did you comply with X, Y, and Z? And so usually that's done just at a staff level. There's occasionally a city has decided we want our planning commission to review SB 35 projects. But it really is in some ways almost counterproductive because you are implying to the commission, but more importantly the community, that there's some come to this public hearing and have your voice heard when there's nothing really.
People could get a little upset.
Yeah, exactly. So many cities have just said anything that's ministerial is just staff level decision.
Yeah, and that means that there's usually no planning commission approval necessary.
Correct.
We're out of that picture.
Correct.
And on one other thing too, I guess by 2025, we're supposed to have pre-approved ADU plans ready to give to applicants. Are we working, I know we talked about this before, that we're working towards that. And I think Fremont maybe already has that in place where it streamlines the process. And even some cities have pre-approved contractors to even further streamline the process. Are we thinking that too?
Yeah, we're not seeking to reinvent the wheel and using our sort of relationships with existing city nearby partners where we might be able to share resources with regards to pre-approved plans. So we'll be looking at that. We've also heard sort of anecdotally that even though we might have, or a city might have pre-approved plans, that oftentimes they're not being used, and that homeowners just want to develop their own plans that work best for their particular situation or the intended use of the ADU, and aren't really finding the pre-approved process very attractive necessarily. So it might be another one of those regulations, again, that had good intentions, but really not many people are taking advantage of it. But we will do what we need to do in order to comply with that.
It sounds to me that we're going to be seeing fewer and fewer projects as far as at the commission level for review, and certainly a lot less public hearings for neighbors that wanted to voice opinions and stuff like that.
Well, certainly, yes. I mean, I think since most things will become either ministerial, when it comes to CEQA review, often that does, sort of elevate the projects up to the decision-making authority in cases. But where CEQA doesn't apply, and it's ministerial, yes, I mean, public bodies will see fewer of those projects for sure.
They're legislating us out of a job.
Well,
Some could be
residential
say
residential projects.
residential projects as well. I mean, planners are sort of feeling that as well. Right now, all we need to do is check boxes, and that's the limit of our professional advice and opinion to our decision-making bodies. Did they check the boxes? Yes.
Yeah, very good
the project.
presentation. That's the only questions I have right now.
Anyone else?
This is just a small one. You were saying that they could sell an ADU.
Yeah, so previously, the law didn't allow you to sell an ADU separate from the main home. The new law permits cities to allow that. So we don't have to allow that, but if a city wanted to, they could allow ADUs to be sold separately within their jurisdiction. I think it's another, the legislature wants to create more home ownership opportunities. And I think that's, their idea. It's a mini condo development of
But you'd
2
have to
units.
carve out that ADU from the existing
Yeah,
property.
and
And
you'd really
Separate
end up,
parcel.
it becomes basically like a little, a 2-unit townhome complex where,
And then that would affect, because the person who owned it originally, they're paying the property taxes for their home in the ADU, and then if they sell the ADU, that's a
gonna be an
separate
interesting
property
wild
tax for
ride.
the person, and then the original person's property tax would go down, because that's not their property anymore.
correct.
And so there's no, for the ADUs and stuff, they can't be used for Airbnb, short-term rentals. That's
Correct.
specifically, yeah.
Yeah, well, yes, the city can prohibit that, and we have here prohibited short-term rental of ADUs.
Do ADUs still have to conform to the setbacks? Or can they be like right up to the fence
The-
line?
They can often be right up to the fence line. So a new ADU normally, in most situations, would have to have at least 4-foot rear and side setbacks. Sometimes the city can require more, but I'd say in most situations, 4 feet is all we can require. Except if you have an existing accessory structure and you are building an ADU either in it or you're tearing that down and building an ADU in the same space, you can match the same footprint. So, you could convert a garage that maybe is up to the property line into an ADU. Or if you had a detached, pool house in the back or something, you could tear that down and build an ADU in that same footprint without complying with that.
assuming it was
setback requirement.
permitted when it was originally
Yeah.
built, right?
If it
Yes.
wasn't permitted when it
That-
was
that's
originally
what
built?
yeah.
Previous setback requirements, it was not permitted.
That's what my position has been. You get crazy people at HCD that sometimes say differently, but that's been my position.
That makes too much sense.
Yeah.
Well, there was a workshop built in the house behind me without permits. And it's like right up to the fence line, like I can just reach and touch it, right, across my fence. And then that house was sold, and then that workshop was made into an ADU. And they had sent a letter, asking, oh, hey, this is gonna be, and I said, no, it's really close to the fence as it is, and the original building wasn't permitted. And, that's gonna be a lot of noise, because it's like this far from the fence, literally. And then the architect that sent the letter called me and said, this is just a formality. You can't complain about this. So that was the end of that. And then it was made into an ADU.
Any other questions? It's a fantastic presentation, very thorough.
Boy,
A
the
little
state's
sad,
been busy,
though.
I'll tell you that.
Kind of sad.
Yeah, did I hear correct, over 200
bills.
being
Yeah, everyone wants their name on a bill, so, you know, you have 3 bills that do the exact same thing, but they all want their name. And I don't know, I've, so many of these bills come about from cities not like this city, but that are bad actors on housing. I mean, like, what percentage of these bills are just because San Francisco, like, has refused to build housing in the last 20, a huge number probably, and there are other suburbs that have been bad, and so the legislature, you know, they'll see something or they'll see someone finding a loophole in some bill, and so they, you know, strike out even more discretion because they're trying to, you know, force those bad actors to behave right, but unfortunately impacts everyone.
right.
But there's no influence by the housing developers or the labor groups in putting these together, right?
No comment.
Yeah, well, and you talked about San Francisco and all the occupancy they have in their commercial buildings, office building and stuff. This is gonna make it easier for them to convert those to residential? That seems to be where they wanna
Yeah,
go.
none of those laws have adopted yet, but Scott Wiener, who's their state senator and
Yes.
who is sort of the main pusher of these housing bills, has proposed bills that, you know, would, I think there's one that would, you know, make it ministerial and also make it not subject to CEQA to convert their commercial buildings within a downtown core in San Francisco.
He's almost termed out though, isn't he?
He just got reelected, or he won his primary, which in San Francisco, you know, he's
Got 4
top
more
two, yeah.
years or
But then he'll be termed out.
to a higher office?
Do a lot of damage.
Yeah. No editorializing around here.
Okay, well, thank you. So that's just a staff report, so we'll move on to item G, commission matters. Item G1, report on city council actions.
Yes, thank you. The only item really to report is to inform the commission that the city council at their January meeting heard the same presentation on the housing element and the non-substantive changes that were made in order to have HCD approve and certify our housing element. So it was essentially the same presentation we gave to the planning commission. Received questions, but there was no action taken on that. And with that, we satisfied our requirements to come back to the planning commission and city council to discuss our housing element. So no other word from the state, so we're still certified and happy with that for sure. And now we're very busy on implementing the housing element and a number of the programs that are due this year for sure. So
Wow.
we have our work cut out for us there. And just to inform the commission that this week, we will have a city council meeting on Thursday. It's focused on budget. And so there's a budget workshop that starts at 5:30. It's relatively informal, but there's a presentation by staff taking a little bit of a look back at our past biennial budget and also anticipating what's coming up for the next fiscal years 25 and 26. So if you're interested, that begins at 5:30. That will be here in council chambers. And no other items to report tonight.
Okay, thank you. Item H, planning commissioner comments. We'll start on this side with Commissioner Catancio.
Yes. Well, overall, I did want to just say that that was a really thorough presentation, so I wanted to thank you for that as well. I think it was a great gathering of education, especially following in the footsteps of the Planning Commissioners Academy that I recently attended. So thank you so much.
Your Bogusic?
Thank you. It was very, very informative, a little sad, very informative. Thank you for making it very understandable too.
Commissioner Fitz?
Yes, I already, very good presentation, and I'm looking forward to serving another term on the city's planning commission under the tutelage of Mr. Jeff Aguilar.
Commissioner Becker?
I just want to say thanks for the presentation as well. It was a very thorough presentation, but always frustrating for me when
You want to cringe sometimes.
I do. But anyway, and I also want to thank Commissioner Fitz for serving for the last year. He did a great job, as usual.
Great, appreciate that.
I echo that I learn from Commissioner Fitz every time he is chair. I take notes and continue to do so. You do a fantastic job, and a lot of what I do when I've been the chair in the past has been learned from you, so thank you.
Appreciate that, thanks.
And again, I want to just restate, fantastic presentation, very educational. I think I have 2.5 pages worth of notes. So I'll figure out a way to make sure I do not lose these, probably take a picture with my phone. With that being, is it possible to circulate the slide deck? Perfect.
Yeah,
Okay,
PDF file or something, yeah.
thank you. The meeting is adjourned.
Good.